Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Mess. So, today we're continuing series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project, and today we're talking about PlayStation 1. I know what you're thinking, we already have a PlayStation 1 core and a PlayStation 1 2X Turbo core, and while that is true and they are amazing, I do think in 2024 there is the ability for MiSTer to play all the PlayStation 1 arcade games that ever exist because there are some great exclusives, and I do love this hardware. And a big thanks to our sponsor this week, MiSTer Add-ons, is going to be sponsoring Thursday videos moving forward. I'll leave a link in the description below to his hardware. It's what I use to capture on the entire channel. I do love this stuff. But taking a look at PlayStation 1 arcade hardware, it is plentiful. There are so many different arcade boards that utilize the PlayStation 1 hardware, both as a base spec model as well as expanded specifications. You can't swing a bat and not hit a PlayStation 1 arcade board in an arcade board collector's house like mine, and there are so many awesome games that we could potentially play on MiSTer in 2024. But obviously we already have the PlayStation 1 core, and it is an absolutely incredible experience on MiSTer. Robert FPGAZumspass, who's currently working on the Nintendo 64 core, brought us this, and it was absolutely revolutionary when we saw this working. He added in so many different enhancements and improvements over base spec hardware, even on the original core, utilizing extra logic elements to be able to bring us a better experience. And this is the full-fat PlayStation 1 as you know, love, and remember it as a home console. And while that hardware is definitely impressive, almost all of the arcade hardware would expand on that specification in one way or another, but I do think based upon the 2X core and some other information, we'd be able to play all of these on MiSTer today. If another developer wanted to pick it up, because Robert has mentioned he's not really into the arcade side of things, and that's totally fair. Everyone on MiSTer makes what they love. Robert loved PlayStation 1, but isn't a huge arcade fan, so that makes sense that he's not really looking into it. But there's a lot of different hardware and a lot of different awesome exclusives that I do think would run on MiSTer. Something like Chaos Heat here from Taito is basically a run-and-gun Resident Evil style survival horror action game that you cannot play any other way outside of software emulation or owning an original GNet board like I do in this video. And these are some awesome games that definitely could be on MiSTer and would be so much fun to have. But let's take a look at the spec sheet here, because the GNet uses the Capcom Sony ZN2 hardware. Now this is an expanded specification off of the PlayStation 1 base spec. It's going to bump the clock speeds, and it's also going to have some other hardware on board. Let's talk about the bump in clock speeds right now. It's around 50 megahertz, and some of the Namco boards will use a 45 megahertz revision, and we do know that a faster CPU is going to be possible on MiSTer FPGA, based specifically on Robert's PlayStation 1 2X core. This is bumping up the clock speeds by 2 times the ratio, so just think of it as a clock multiplier. It shows that you can get a 2x bump in the clocks on MiSTer, and everything runs stable, everything works, and it is possible to fit within the logic elements of the DE10 Nano board on the MiSTer FPGA stack in and of itself. So that is a good first indication that this would be totally fine, but there's definitely other hardware involved that we'll get to in just a moment. But again, with that clock multiplier, you're just getting better performance out of the stock PlayStation 1 experience. Something right here you'll see on the left on the 2X core, we're hovering near to 60 frames per second, where on the right you're at the 48 to 50 mark. And even games that are on PlayStation 1 ported from arcade, Strider 2 here, you're going to be around 30 frames per second locked on the standard core. And if we go over to 2X, you're going to be at 42 to 45. Now sometimes this does affect the speed of the gameplay, it'll run a little bit fast, but what it tells us is that we do have the ability to be able to upclock the CPU and the rest of the PlayStation 1 on MiSTer, and it is going to be functionally fine as far as the hardware is concerned. And getting these speed bumps in the PlayStation 1 core is a ton of fun, but on the arcade side it's not really going to speed things up, it's just going to make it possible. Now as well, you're going to see that there are additional sound chips on some boards, like the Capcom ZN1 and ZN2 are going to utilize the Capcom Q sound chip, but we know we can already run that on MiSTer because of Hotego and his CPS2 cores. These utilize Q sound, and the implementation is already within another core on MiSTer FPGA, so that work has already been done, and that is great. You could pick, borrow, beg, and steal different parts of different cores to be able to assemble this thing, but listen for like 35 seconds at the Q sound. It's so unique, and I will be right back.
Welcome to the adventure! Danger!
The Q sound chip always had a unique sound, and I'm sure Capcom utilized it because they were comfortable programming for it. And I know what you're thinking, some of these games were ported home to PlayStation 1, so why would we need them on a PlayStation 1 arcade core? The thing is, there are a lot of different boards that utilize the Sony PlayStation hardware, and most if not all of them are going to have better experiences than we saw at home. Something like the Namco boards, if you take a look at ear guides here, this is the PlayStation 1 version. You're going to notice that the models lack some polygons, the ring has no logo on the bottom whatsoever. There's nothing inside of the ring, and all of the viewers watching this fight in the background are absolutely stationary, and they are not doing anything. As we move over to the arcade original, you're going to see a big jump in graphical fidelity. The frame rate is faster, there's more textures, and that audience in the background is moving around. This in the arcade version is so much better than the PlayStation 1 release. It would be great if we could play this at home without collecting arcade boards like I do. Now, just because we have the clock speeds, we have the ability to run a faster PlayStation 1 to hit that arcade spec, doesn't mean there don't need to be other pivots in the hardware design. Something like Crickkiller is going to use a SCSI hard drive, and something like the GNet is going to use these compact flash style cards PCMCIA design. So there's definitely going to be some work under the hood that would need to be done to actually load the data into a core so that those games could execute within the PlayStation 1 architecture that Robert has already done. You'll even see on some boards, just like the PlayStation 1 console, it is going to be disk based, but interestingly enough, it's going to take what the PlayStation 1 does and pivot it a little bit because it's going to go to a SCSI CD-ROM drive. So SCSI implementation would have to be brought to a potential PlayStation 1 arcade core so that most if not all of the games would load up. You have so many different formats here. As you take a look at a PlayStation 1 motherboard, the chips on board here are going to be near identical to what you see when you actually get over to an arcade side, and in some instances like the Konami GV, they are going to be one-to-one identical. The only difference here in hardware is that there's a JAMMA Edge and a SCSI CD-ROM drive, but otherwise everything is going to be functionally the same, except it's going to be a lot dirtier. This is the other hard part about collecting arcade PCBs, why I'd love to see something like PlayStation 1 arcade games on MiSTer. Keeping them clean and keeping them working is a very difficult task. But the reality is there's a lot of fun games on the PlayStation 1 arcade side of things, and I know a lot of people have been asking me whether they think PlayStation 1 arcade will ever come to MiSTer. The reality is I have absolutely no idea. It does seem technically feasible, but there are a lot of steps involved here. If we take a look at the Namco System 12, again, you're going to see that it has a bump in the clock speeds. It's running at 48 megahertz versus the stock PlayStation 1 original. But again, we know that is achievable because we've already seen it done by Robert in the 2X core. That is the biggest thing. We know that we can get the clock speeds out of MiSTer to be able to play something like that game on MiSTer FPGA. And if we take a look at the games on this board, there are a metric crap ton of awesome games and some genuinely Hall of Fame first ballot good arcade exclusives on here. Something like Golgo 13. I absolutely love this game. I don't believe it ever came to North America as an arcade release. It's basically like Point Blank except not with the comedy aspect to it. But it is such a fun time to play, and because we do have GunCon implementation within the PlayStation 1 core and MiSTer FPGA in general, this is something you could play on your television. Like 65-inch 4K would look great with this. Using the GunCon 3 and a PlayStation 1 arcade core, I would absolutely love it, and the only way you can play this game is with real arcade hardware or via MAME emulation. Or something like Crickkiller here, one of my favorite games of all time. It is just so much better in the arcade version than it is on PlayStation 1. It took a massive graphical downgrade just to get across the board. And something like Baby Phoenix, like I said earlier, is a bone stock PlayStation 1. All you would need to do is pivot over to that SCSI CD-ROM drive, and you could be playing PlayStation 1 arcade games today. All you would need to do is get the BIOS going on this system as well, because it does have different BIOSes depending on what arcade board you're using, and there's going to be a different post sequence for pretty much every piece of hardware. But the reality is, across the entire PlayStation 1 arcade hardware spectrum, it is all within a spec that we're already seeing run on MiSTer FPGA with the PlayStation 1 2X core. So that means, as far as I can tell, and again, filmmaker not engineer, all of these arcade games would run on MiSTer FPGA. So hopefully somebody decides that's a project they want to take on in 2024, because I would absolutely love to play all of these games in FPGA. I own a metric crap ton of PlayStation 1 arcade boards, but they're hard to hook up, and I'd love to do it in the comfort of my living room with MiSTer. Short of that, I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.